Hello everyone, welcome to the course on Health Humanities, Indian and Western Medical Knowledge Traditions. This is lecture number 16 on Health, Illness and Western Modernity. In this lecture, I will talk about the development of different medical practices and how certain illnesses have been categorized, organized and disciplined. In this lecture, I will discuss about the notions of madness, surveillance, confinement, asylums, mental illnesses, and disciplining of sexuality. This lecture is basically dealing with the works of Michel Foucault, particularly Madness and Civilization, and Discipline and Punishment. I have some references also from History of Sexuality, Volume 1, and some other essays. When we look at the idea of illness, idea of health in Michel Foucault, the very prominent thought which comes to our mind is whether Foucault is someone who is taking a kind of instance where he puts forward a new notion of categorizing mental illnesses, and in this way he goes against the popular notions of enlightenment, be it reason, progress and science. He finds that the idea of progress and reason have not been able to consider the problems of mental health, madness, the problems of sexuality, which have been quote unquote sometimes categorized as abnormality. And in this regard, Foucault has taken a deep critique of Enlightenment rationality. He brings back the idea of a sociological approach to health and illness. And further, he talks about illness and explains it from sociological perspective. And then he discusses the idea of medical gaze, the objectification of the body of patients by the doctors, and how they investigate, how they look at the illness and disease. Moreover, he talks about that the idea of normal health is historically contingent. It is not something pre-given, natural. Rather, it is a kind of social and political construct. And further, he talks about medicalization of everyday life. And when we look at the emotions of ourselves, our behaviors of ourselves, they have been conditioned by certain medical discourses, certain medical practices. It also takes into consideration the emotions and behaviors which have been seen as abnormal or unacceptable in the society, and then how they are controlled, how they are transformed, and then how they are mitigated to bring back in the state of normalcy. So in this way, Foucault talks about a lot of critical concepts which governs his concept of health and illness. And these critical concepts are disciplinary power. Foucault says that there are two types of power. One, which he calls productive power, and then another one is repressive power. And in a repressive, then there are further divisions, like those which are regulated by jurisdictions, which are regulated by laws. He calls it a juridico-discursive power. And those which are controlled by certain kind of social, institutional and hegemonic mechanism. And that is a kind of power which have been under action through different mediums. And so these powers help in regulating the behavior of the people, how they live, how they behave, how they talk. So this is a societal regulation and behavioral control of human beings. And then the people who are seen as mad, abnormal, insane, and unfit to live in the society because of certain health issues, and then they are put in some kind of surveillance, and which is a mechanism of control, which is a mechanism of keeping an eye on those who are not found medically fit. The purpose of disciplinary power and panopticism is to bring some kind of normalization of the people who are sick, who are ill, who are not normal. And in this way, it enforces normalcy over the people who are quote-unquote abnormal. Further, the normalization is taken forward with the notion of power knowledge. And how power knowledge dominates, this is like a further subject of debate. By the way, there are no easy acceptance of these methods of control, these notions of regulations of human behavior. Of course, there are moments of resistance, and this resistance can be from the people who are sick, and they try to resist, they try to control certain things which have been inflicted upon them, on their body, on their mind. So let us look at the idea of madness. Foucault says that madness is both a lived experience as well as a medical condition, but the general discourse has made it as a lived experience, where the people who are mad, they are seen as a threat to the society, as someone who can live in exclusions, and hence there is an emphasis on exclusion, marginalization, and control on the people who are considered mad, who are considered insane, abnormal. And they have been put outside the cities, outside the general public domain, and then there are certain mediums through which their madnesses, their abnormalities are controlled. And in Foucault, there are like instances where he talks about the concept of the ship of fools in the Middle Ages. Though like the madmen are seen as a wanderer, but they are also seen as someone who are having some kind of divine insights, inspiration. They have poetic imaginations and have been associated with cosmic truth. But these kind of representations of mad people got shifted to the idea of insanity, abnormality, and because of this shift, there is a moment that when these mad people were transferred to different localities, different places, they were brought in the middle of sea and then left to their own future, their own destiny. When we look at the conceptualization of madness in the period of Renaissance, before medieval period, mad people had been seen with some kind of divine insight, poetic imagination. This is what Foucault justifies and asserts in his Madness and Civilization, that in Renaissance, madness was present everywhere and mingled with every experience by its images or its dangers. During the classical period, madness was shown, but on the other side of bars. On the other side of bars. If present, it was at a distance, under the eyes of a region that no longer felt any relation to it and would not compromise itself by too close a resemblance. what Foucault says over here, that the people who were considered mad were not segregated and excluded during the period of Renaissance. They were part of the society. But later on, they were put aside. There was a kind of segregation, and they were not seen as a person to be lived with other people. So what we find over here, that how the idea of mental illness, madness, creates a social segregation. It creates some kind of segregation, exclusion, where these people are left to suffer by themselves, and they have been seen as a threat, as abnormal people, and who can actually spoil the society. So with the advancement of modernity, the people who are seen as mad, they were segregated and separated and excluded. So the idea of modernity was to bring back, or to bring the notion of civilization. And in a civilized society, there was no space for mad people. And this idea of segregation has become very prominent, and this idea of exclusion is also prominent with the concept of modernity. When we have segregation of mad people, then there was a requirement of space for the mad people, where to place them, where to house them. And in this regard, there was a need to look at some of the buildings, some of the structures which were there. And the history shows that around 1200 AD or 12th century, there were a number of leper houses which were built in Europe. And it was meant for containing leprosy to spread in the rest of the population. And the people who were having leprosy, they were confined. By the time of 12th century, the records suggest that there were around 220 leper houses in England and Scotland. But taking the idea, these leper houses were then began to get freed and vacated, and the people who are then found socially useless, idle, poor, abnormal, they were being confined to these leper houses. So the leper houses, the hospitals which were there earlier, they were converted to places of confinement for the people who are abnormal, who are mentally sick, who are mad. So taking the idea of confinement of lepers, the idea of confining mad people began in Europe. When we look at the records of the Hospital General in Paris, it suggests that there were around 6,000 people who were confined there. And this further leads to the birth of asylum. In 18th and 19th century, there was a rise of psychiatry and medical institutions. And then they began to find out the people who are not fit to live in the society, who are mad, who are poor, who are having some kind of mental disturbances, and they need to get contained, or they need to get confined in the asylums. However, the purpose of asylums was not to have some kind of not to inflict some kind of physical punishment on the people who are mad, who are sick. So asylums was a new form of, a civilized form of punishing the people who are quote unquote mentally abnormal. So the idea of asylums, the idea of confinement, the idea of imprisonment, the idea of confining people in labor houses, they are the modern notions of confinement and modern notions of civilization, where these people are kept aside. What we notice over here, that in modernity, what they call civilization, what they call social advancement, there are instances where a number of people have been confined, segregated, and put aside only in the name of lighter punishment or no punishment. And so what we find in the 18th and 19th century, when there was a rise of psychiatry and medical institutions, these asylums were no longer seen as a medium for punishing the madman for their guilt. And Foucault writes in Madness and Civilization, the asylum no longer punished the madman's guilt, but it did more. It organized that guilt. It organized it from the madman as a consciousness of himself. So the asylums are seen as a form of correcting, healing, and curing madness. So what we find over here, that asylums and confinement houses are seen as sources of healing, cure, treatment, and so on and so forth. Foucault further says about asylums that the asylum was substitute for the leper house, and where these asylums were built, he says, in the geography of haunted places as in the landscape of moral universe. So these asylums are built outside the city, the places which are seen which are considered to be haunted, which are not inhabited by any human beings. The old rites of excommunication were revived, but in the world of production and commerce, it was in these places of doomed and despised idleness. So these places where leper houses, where asylums were built, these places are seen to be doomed and despised. And further, in this space illuminated by a society which had derived an ethical transcendence from the law of work, that madness would appear and soon expand until it had annexed them. The 19th century would consent, would even insist that to the mad and to them alone be transferred these lands, of which 150 years before men had thought to pen the poor, the vagabond, and the unemployed. So the people who are seen mad, they are having confinement houses, asylums, but they are to places which are not fit for other human beings, and so they have been given space. And the people who are who are shifted there, they are a number of people who are poor, who are vagabond, who are unemployed. They have been medically, they have been socially declared unfit. And to keep and watch on the people who are seen unfit, mad, disturbed, mentally sick, there was the idea of surveillance, which was practiced with the notion of panopticon. Foucault, by borrowing the idea of Jeremy Bentham, says that it is an architectural device which is used for observing the people who are having some kind of mental disturbance. What happens in panopticon? This is a kind of circular or semicircular architectural structure, and in the middle there is a tower, and the rooms of that architecture have two tall windows, one opening towards the tower in the center, other one opening to the outside for the sake of light, air. Foucault writes in The Eye of Power that These panopticons are a perimeter building in the form of a ring. That panopticon are built in the form of in a circle. At the center of this a tower passed by large windows opening on the inner face of the ring. The outer building is divided into cells, each of which traverses the whole thickness of the building. These cells have two windows, one opening onto the inside, facing the windows of the central tower, the other outer one, allowing daylight to pass through the whole cell. All that is then needed to put an overseer in the tower and place in each of the cells a lunatic, a patient, a convict, a worker, a schoolboy. The backlighting enables one to pick out from the central power the little captive silhouettes in the ring of the cell. In short, the principle of the dungeon is reversed. Daylight and the overseer's gaze captures the inmate more effectively than darkness, which affords, after all, a sort of protection. So, panopticon is a circular building, and in the center is a tower where a man is put to keep an eye to observe the people who are put in these cells. And the people who are put in these cells are lunatics, patients, convicts, schoolboys, mad people, and so many others. And then they have been observed, they have been watched. But the people like who have been observed, who have been surveillanced, they have no idea about this. So the idea of ethical consent becomes necessary. And second thing, that the people who are not having any kind of threat to the society have been also imprisoned in these cells. Moreover, the people who are having any kind of mental illness, madness, they have been stigmatized. And Foucault says the asylum is not a free realm of observation, diagnosis, and therapeutics. It is a juridical space from where one is accused, judged, and condemned, and from which one is never released, except by the version of this trial in psychological depth, that is, by remorse. Madness will be punished in the asylum, even if it is innocent outside of it, for a long time to come, and until our own day, at least, it is imprisoned in a normal world. So, asylums are not only a space for keeping a surveillance, observation, keeping an eye on the people who are ill and then making record of their illness. I mean, it is not a medium of diagnosis only, or it's a medium of therapeutics only. It is also a juridical space where the people who have been stigmatized, they have been judged, condemned. So they have been defined, they have been put in some frames, and then they are never able to come out of these frames. So what we find over here, that the social, political scenario, maybe medical scenario, tries to actually define, associate certain norms to the people who are mad, who are sick, and they are punished even though they are innocent. And so in this way, they are seen as someone immoral. What we find over here, that the people who are having mental illness, they have been given certain kind of social definitions which are meant to exclude them, which are meant to oppress them, which are meant to suppress them in the society. And these oppressions and regulations work by in terms of surveillance, and this surveillance are not only limited to the asylums, confinement houses. These surveillance are also spread through different institutions like schools, hospitals, courts, and so many other social institutions. And so there is a need for regimentation for the people who are seen as abnormal, which leads to the disciplining of the people who are abnormal, and in consequence, they need to actually internalize the mechanism of control and modify their behaviors. In this regard, the idea of sexuality becomes necessary to discuss. When we look at the concept of sexuality in 18th and 19th century, Foucault says that he is not concerned about the sexuality of male and female or how they have been represented. He says that one has to think about the sexuality of children, married men and women and criminals. The sensuality of those who did not like the opposite sex. Reveries, obsessions, petty manias, the great transport of race. It was the time of all these figures scarcely noticed in the past. To step forward and speak, to make the difficult confessions of what they were. So the people like who are not having interest in the heterosexuality, and then how they have been medically, socially and culturally repressed, oppressed and then excluded. He further says, Foucault further says that the question of sex was a constant preoccupation. The builders considered it explicitly. The organizers took it permanently into account. All who held a measure of authority were placed in the state of perpetual alert. The space of classes, the shapes of the tables, the planning of the recreation lessons, the distribution of dormitories, which includes having no partitions and no curtains in the rooms, the rules for monitoring bedtime and sleep periods. All this referred in most prolix manner to the sexuality of children. So here what we find that we have disciplining of sexuality. It is found in the architectures of schools, it is found in the spaces, it is found in the shapes, it is found in the tables, chairs, how they have been arranged, and all of them are meant to keep a kind of surveillance, to make them disciplined and to keep control over one's sexuality. Because sexuality was seen as a general public problem, and hence doctors were given the task of counseling the directors, the professors of educational establishments. They also gave their opinions to the families. So what we find that doctors were prescribing norms to the family members, to the professors, to the directors of the educational institutions, and educators designed projects which they submitted to the authorities. The schoolmaster turned to students, made recommendations to them, and drafted for their bereft books of exhortation, full of moral and medical examples. And so we have doctors, we have educational men who are guiding, who are actually interpellating the mind of people to behave in a particular way. And around the schoolboy and his sex, there proliferated a whole literature of precepts, opinions, observations, medical advice, clinical cases, outline of reform, and plans for the ideal institutions. So what we find over here is a nexus of medical men, educational systems, and so many other moral and social norms which govern the sexuality of human beings, and those whom they consider unfit, they are called sick, abnormal. So people have been called abnormal, sick, insane by the norms which have been put forward by doctors, professors, educational establishments, and those who do not fit them or fit there, they have been segregated and excluded. And however, there was a shift in terms of physical punishment too, like putting them under some kind of asylums or some kind of confinement. And there was, like earlier, a kind of like a public exhibition of the people who are sick, who are mentally ill, but now they have been kept inside these houses. So there are like different ways for disciplining the people who have been called mentally disturbed. And moving further, one has to think about then, like when we have confinement, when we have control over other people, the idea of morality, whether is it interfering in their freedom, is it only for the sake of security? Like what happens, there are like a lot of surveillance, and those surveillances are made in the name of securities. Think about CCTV camera, this is also a form of surveillance. Think about power relations, that those people like who are seen mentally disturbed, who are seen mad, and then how they face certain punitive, maybe certain kind of therapy. So is it like therapy, or is it some kind of punishment that they receive? One has to think about the role of state, how they control their liberty. Think about their consent and autonomy. So there are several dimensions which one has to rethink, and how they have been violated in the 18th and 19th century. So to conclude, I say that Foucault's Madness and Civilization was a critique of Enlightenment rationality. It says that there was a kind of rational progress, but on the other side, there was oppression of the people, people who were seen abnormal, mad, who was seen sexually deviant. And the idea of madness crosses and the social border, and they are segregated and punished. It actually puts forward the false notion of normalcy, that the people who are not fitting in the line of, in the set norms of doctors and moral preachers, ethical preachers, then they are abnormal. So Foucault critiques the idea of normalcy. It challenges the idea of mental health in the 18th and 19th century, and he asserts to revise the history of mental illness. He says that madness is a social construction, it is a cultural construction, it's a medical construction, it is a political construction, it is a construction of power and knowledge, and one has to critique this. He further talks about the idea of confinement, but let us think about what could be the modern equivalents for the confinement which Foucault is talking about, or what are the modern equivalents of panopticism which Foucault is talking about. One can think about contemporary ways of surveillance. It can be CCTV camera, it can be social media, it can be any kind of data leaking which are happening in the contemporary times. So what Foucault has talked about in the context of 16th, 17th, 18th and 19th century, but in the different form. Thank you.